The farm sat at the edge of the world, or so it seemed. Miles of empty fields stretched toward a horizon that swallowed the sun each evening without ceremony. The house itself was small, weathered, its white paint peeling like old skin. A single porch light flickered against the encroaching dark, a weak declaration that life still persisted here, however quietly. Inside, the old man sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded over a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His name was Vincent Carraro, though no one had called him that in over 30 years. To the few neighbors who saw him at the general store in town, he was just Vince, a retired nobody who kept to himself and his wife. They did not know that once, in another life, he had been the Consigliere to one of the most feared dons on the East Coast. They did not know that his counsel had decided the fates of men, that his silence had buried more secrets than the earth itself. His wife, Margaret, moved quietly through the kitchen, her steps careful and deliberate. She was 73, her hair silver and tied back in a loose bun, her hands marked by age, but still steady. She had known what Vincent was when she married him. She had accepted it, loved him despite it, and when he told her they had to disappear, she had packed a single suitcase and never looked back. That was in 1993. The old Don, Salvatore Greco, had been shot dead in his own mansion during a feast meant to celebrate a truce. Blood had pooled across the marble floors, mixing with spilled wine. The family had fractured. Underbosses turned on each other. Capos vanished. Soldiers fled. In the chaos, Vincent had taken something that did not belong to him. The ledger. It was a thick book bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and stained. Inside were names, dates, amounts. Bribes paid to judges and senators, contracts on rival bosses, offshore accounts, safe houses. The entire architecture of the family's empire, written in the old Don's own hand. Vincent had kept it hidden in the Don's private study, a room only he and Salvatore ever entered. When the shooting started, he had grabbed it and run. He told himself it was insurance, that if anyone came for him, he could bargain. But the years passed, and no one came. The family collapsed entirely. The new bosses were younger, hungrier, more reckless. They did not care about the old ways, the old debts. Vincent and Margaret built a quiet life on this farm, far from the cities where blood debts were still honored. But tonight, Vincent felt the weight of the past pressing against his chest like a stone. Margaret set a plate of bread and cheese on the table. She looked at him, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You have not eaten," she said. "I am not hungry. You have been staring at that coffee for an hour." Vincent looked up at her. His face was lined and weathered, his eyes a faded grey that once had been piercing. He had been handsome in his youth, a man who could command a room with a single glance. Now he was just an old man with too many ghosts. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked quietly. "About what we left behind?" Margaret sat down across from him. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "Every day," she said. "But we are still here. That is what matters." Vincent nodded, but the unease remained. For weeks now he had felt it, a creeping sense that something was coming. He had noticed the black sedan that passed by the farm twice in 3 days. He had seen the way the clerk at the general store looked at him last week, nervous, avoiding eye contact. Small things, maybe nothing. But Vincent had survived as long as he had because he trusted his instincts. Margaret squeezed his hand. "If you are worried, we can leave again," she said. "We have done it before." Vincent shook his head. "I am too old to run," he said. "And where would we go? This is our home now." Margaret did not argue. She knew him too well. If Vincent had decided to stay, then they would stay. She stood and kissed the top of his head, then moved toward the hallway. "I am going to bed," she said. "Do not stay up too late." Vincent listened to her footsteps fade down the hall, then the soft click of the bedroom door closing. He sat alone in the dim kitchen, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. After a long moment, he stood and walked to the corner of the room where a narrow door led down to the cellar. He descended the wooden steps slowly, his knees protesting with each movement. The cellar was cold and damp, lit by a single bare bulb that swung gently when he pulled the chain. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserves, old tools, forgotten things. In the far corner, beneath a tarp covered in dust, was a metal box. Vincent knelt beside it, his breath coming harder now. He lifted the tarp and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the ledger. He had not looked at it in years. He unwrapped it carefully, as if it might crumble in his hands. The leather cover was cool to the touch. He opened it to the first page. Salvatore Greco. Accounts. 1972-1993. The handwriting was bold and deliberate. The ink faded but still legible. Vincent turned the pages slowly, reading names he had not thought of in decades. Judges who had taken bribes. Cops who had looked the other way. Rival bosses who had been eliminated. The sums were staggering, even by today's standards. Millions of dollars hidden in accounts across a dozen countries. And there, near the end of the book, was the entry that had haunted Vincent all these years. The red safe house. Location, redacted. Access code, known only to the Consigliere. Vincent had never told anyone about the red safe house, not even Margaret. It was a place Salvatore had prepared for the end, a fortress hidden deep in the mountains, stocked with cash, weapons, and documents, a place to disappear if everything fell apart. Vincent had the access code memorized. He had never used it, but he knew that if the family ever learned he had the ledger, they would come for it. And they would come for him. He closed the book and wrapped it again, placing it back in the box. His hands were shaking. He was not afraid of dying. He had made his peace with that long ago, but he was afraid of what they might do to Margaret. She was innocent. She had only ever loved him. Vincent climbed the stairs and returned to the kitchen. He locked the cellar door and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He drank it slowly, staring out the window at the dark fields beyond. Somewhere out there, he knew, men were coming, men who had heard whispers, men who wanted what he had taken, men who would not leave until they got it. But Vincent Carraro was not the same man who had fled 30 years ago. He had spent those years planning, preparing. He had turned this quiet farm into something else, a place where secrets could be kept, a place where debts could be paid. If they came for him, they would find that the old Consigliere had not forgotten the lessons of the life he left behind. He finished his whiskey and set the glass down. Then he walked to the bedroom where Margaret lay sleeping, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe. "I will not let them touch you," he whispered. Then he closed the door and went to prepare. 300 miles away, in a penthouse suite overlooking the city, a younger man sat in a leather chair, smoking a cigarette. His name was Dominic Falcone, and he was the new underboss of what remained of the Greco family. He was 42, sharp-featured, with dark hair slicked back and a suit that cost more than most people made in a year. He was ambitious, ruthless, and hungry for legitimacy in a world that had moved on from the old ways. But Dominic had recently learned something that changed everything. The ledger still existed. An old soldier, dying of cancer, had whispered it to him on his deathbed, told him that the Consigliere had taken it, told him that if Dominic could find it, he could rebuild the family, reclaim the hidden fortunes, buy back the power that had been lost. Dominic had spent 6 months tracking Vincent Carraro. The man had vanished so completely that most people assumed he was dead. But Dominic had resources, he had patience, and he had found him. Now, sitting across from Dominic were 2 men. The first was Marco Vitale, a thick-necked enforcer with a face like a clenched fist. Marco had served the family for 20 years, and he had a reputation for brutality that made even other criminals nervous. The second man was quieter, leaner, dressed in black. His name was Luca, and he was a hitman, a professional who did not ask questions and did not leave witnesses. "You understand what I need," Dominic said, his voice calm but cold. Marco nodded. "We get the book. We bring it back. What about the old man?" Dominic took a long drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "If he cooperates, Let him live. If he does not—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Luca spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "And the wife?" Dominic looked at him, his eyes flat and unreadable. "Whatever is necessary." The two men stood. Marco cracked his knuckles. Luca adjusted his coat. They left without another word. Dominic watched them go, then turned to the window. The city stretched out below him, glittering and indifferent. He had waited long enough. The past was coming due, and Vincent Carraro, the silent keeper of secrets, would finally answer for what he had taken. The black sedan rolled down the dirt road at dusk, its headlights cutting through the thickening dark. The landscape was desolate, fields of dead grass stretching endlessly on either side. The sun had dropped below the horizon, leaving only a bruised purple sky streaked with the last traces of light. The road itself was barely maintained, riddled with potholes that jolted the car with each pass. Inside, Marco Vitale sat in the passenger seat, his massive frame filling the space. He had rolled down the window despite the cold, letting the wind rush against his face. He liked the feeling of it, raw and unfiltered. It reminded him of the old days, when jobs like this were common, when the family had work every week. Now, things were quieter, too quiet. But this job was different. This was personal for Dominic, and Marco knew that personal jobs paid better. Behind the wheel was Luca, the hitman. He drove with mechanical precision, his eyes never leaving the road. He had not spoken since they left the city 6 hours ago. Marco had worked with men like Luca before, professionals who treated killing like accounting, cold and efficient. Marco preferred a different approach. He liked to see fear in a man's eyes, to feel the struggle before the end. But he respected Luca's discipline. The man got results. "How much further?" Marco asked, breaking the silence. Luca glanced at the GPS mounted on the dashboard. 3 miles, he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "The farm is just past the next rise." Marco nodded and cracked his knuckles. He had been sitting too long. His body ached for movement, for violence. He reached into his coat and checked the pistol holstered under his arm. A Glock 19, loaded and ready, simple, reliable. Marco did not believe in fancy weapons. A gun was a tool, nothing more. Luca noticed the gesture but said nothing. He had his own weapon, a suppressed Beretta, tucked neatly in a shoulder rig beneath his jacket. He also carried a knife, a thin blade that he kept strapped to his ankle. He preferred the knife for certain situations. Quiet, personal. No mess to clean up afterward if you knew what you were doing. The car crested the rise, and there it was, the farm. A small house with peeling paint, a sagging porch, a single light burning in the window. A barn stood off to the side, its doors hanging open, swaying slightly in the wind. Behind the house, fields stretched into darkness. It looked abandoned, forgotten, but Marco knew better. The old man was here, he could feel it. Luca slowed the car and pulled off the road about a quarter-mile from the house. He killed the engine and the headlights. The sudden silence was jarring. Marco could hear his own breathing, the distant rustle of wind through dry grass. "We walk from here," Luca said. "Do not want to announce ourselves." Marco grunted his agreement. They got out of the car, their doors closing with soft clicks. The air was cold, biting. Marco zipped his jacket higher and rolled his shoulders. Luca moved like a shadow, his steps deliberate and soundless. Marco followed, trying to match the hitman's quiet grace, but knowing he was too large, too heavy to ever truly disappear. They approached the house slowly, keeping to the edges of the road, where the gravel would not crunch beneath their feet. The light in the window remained steady, casting a faint yellow glow across the porch. Marco could see movement inside, a figure passing by the window, the old man, or maybe the wife. Luca raised a hand, signaling Marco to stop. They crouched behind a rusted tractor that sat abandoned in the field. Luca pulled a small pair of binoculars from his coat and studied the house. "One light," he whispered. "Kitchen. I see the old man. Sitting at the table, no sign of the wife." "She is probably asleep," Marco said. "Old people go to bed early." Luca lowered the binoculars and looked at Marco. "We go in quiet. No guns unless necessary. Dominic wants the book, not a war." Marco frowned. He did not like the idea of going in soft, but he nodded. Fine, but if the old man tries anything, I am not holding back. Luca said nothing. He tucked the binoculars away and moved forward, staying low. Marco followed, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. They crossed the field and reached the edge of the yard. The house loomed before them, silent and still. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. Luca motioned toward the back of the house. They circled around, their steps careful. The back door was old, wooden, with a single deadbolt. Luca examined it for a moment, then pulled a small set of lockpicks from his pocket. He worked quickly, his hands steady. Within seconds, the lock clicked open. Marco watched the windows, his senses on high alert. But there was no movement, no sound. The house was quiet, too quiet. Luca pushed the door open slowly, wincing as the hinges creaked. They stepped inside, into a narrow hallway that smelled of old wood and dust. The kitchen was to their right, the light spilling through the doorway. Luca moved first, his hand on his weapon. Marco followed, his bulk filling the hallway. They reached the kitchen doorway and stopped. Vincent Carraro sat at the table, his back to them. He had not moved. His hands were folded in front of him, his head bowed slightly. A cup of coffee sat untouched on the table. Marco stepped forward, his pistol drawn. "Do not move, old man," he said, his voice low and hard. Vincent did not flinch. He did not turn. He simply sat there, as if he had been expecting them. "I wondered when you would come," Vincent said quietly. His voice was calm, almost resigned. Luca moved to the side, positioning himself so he could see Vincent's hands. He did not trust the old man's stillness. Men who did not panic were dangerous. "Where is the ledger?" Luca asked. Vincent finally turned his head, looking at them over his shoulder. His face was lined and tired, but his eyes were sharp, clear. He studied the two men for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "So that is what this is about," he said. "After all these years, someone finally remembered." Marco stepped closer, his pistol aimed at Vincent's head. "Answer the question, old man. Where is the book?" Vincent turned back to face the table. He picked up the coffee cup and took a slow sip, as if he had all the time in the world. "You come into my home," Vincent said softly. "You threaten me, and you expect me to simply hand over what you want." Marco's jaw tightened. He raised the pistol higher. "I'm not asking again." Vincent set the cup down gently. He folded his hands again and looked at Marco. "The book is safe," he said. "And if you want it, you are going to have to do better than waving a gun at an old man." Marco's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could pull it, Luca spoke. "Where is your wife?" The question hung in the air. Vincent's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Fear, just for a moment. "She is asleep," Vincent said. Luca shook his head slowly. "No, she is not. I checked the bedroom before we came in. It is empty." Vincent's hands tightened, his knuckles going white. He did not speak. Marco grinned, sensing weakness. "Where is she, old man? Did you send her away? Or is she hiding somewhere, waiting for us to leave?" Vincent stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He turned to face them fully now, his back straight despite his age. "You leave her out of this," he said, his voice hard. "This is between you and me." Luca stepped forward, his eyes cold. "Nothing is between you and us. You took something that belongs to the family. We are here to get it back. If your wife gets in the way, that is not our problem." Vincent's jaw clenched. For a moment, the old Consigliere was visible beneath the aged exterior. The man who had counseled a Don, who had ordered deaths with a whisper, who had buried secrets in silence. "If you touch her," Vincent said quietly, "I will make sure neither of you leave this farm alive." Marco laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You're going to stop us. Look at you. You are old, broken. You cannot even stand without shaking." Vincent did not respond. He simply stared at Marco, his eyes burning with something cold and ancient. Luca raised a hand, silencing Marco. "Enough. We did not come here to kill you, old man. We came for the book. Give it to us, and we leave. You and your wife can live out the rest of your days in peace." Vincent laughed bitterly. Peace. You think Dominic Falcone will let me live? The moment you have that book, I am a loose end, and the family does not leave loose ends. Luca did not deny it. He simply waited. Vincent took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. The book is in the cellar, he said. I will take you to it. Marco looked at Luca, uncertain. This was too easy, but Luca nodded. Show us. Vincent walked slowly toward the corner of the kitchen, where the cellar door stood. He opened it, revealing the dark stairway leading down. He descended the steps, his movements careful. Marco and Luca followed, their weapons ready. The cellar was cold and damp, lit by a single bare bulb that swung gently. Vincent moved to the corner where the metal box sat beneath the tarp. He knelt beside it, his breath coming harder now. He opened the box and pulled out the ledger, still wrapped in oilcloth. He held it out to Luca. Here, Vincent said, take it. But know that the moment you do, you are marked men. Luca took the ledger, unwrapping it slowly. He opened it to the first page and scanned the entries. His expression did not change, but Marco saw the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. This is it, Luca said quietly. Marco grinned. Good. Now, we can finish this. He raised his pistol, aiming it at Vincent's head. But before he could pull the trigger, Vincent spoke. Before you kill me, Vincent said, you should know something. Marco hesitated. What? Vincent smiled, a cold, empty smile. This farm is not what it seems. I have had 30 years to prepare for this moment, and you just walked into a trap. Marco's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Vincent did not answer. Instead, he pressed a button hidden beneath the edge of the metal box. Somewhere in the darkness, something clicked. Then the lights went out. The darkness was absolute. Marco swore and swung his pistol wildly, trying to locate Vincent in the blackness. He could hear Luca breathing beside him, controlled and steady, but even the hitman seemed caught off guard. Where is he? Marco hissed. Quiet, Luca whispered. Listen. They stood frozen in the cellar, their eyes useless. Marco strained to hear anything, any sign of movement, but there was only silence, thick and suffocating. Then, from somewhere above them, a voice echoed down through the darkness. Vincent, you should have left when you had the chance, the old man said. His voice was calm, almost sad. But you came into my home. You threatened my wife, and now you are going to learn what happens when you disturb the past. Marco fired blindly toward the sound of the voice. The muzzle flash lit the cellar for a brief instant, revealing empty space where Vincent had been standing moments before. The bullet ricocheted off stone, and then the darkness swallowed everything again. He is gone, Luca said quietly. He knows this place. We do not. Marco's breathing was heavy now, edged with frustration. We need light. Luca pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the cellar walls, the empty shelves, the metal box still sitting open on the floor. But Vincent was nowhere to be seen. There, Marco said, pointing to a narrow opening in the far wall, partially hidden behind a shelf. A passageway. Luca moved toward it, his flashlight leading the way. Marco followed, his pistol raised. The passage was tight, the walls pressing in on either side. It smelled of earth and rot, and the floor sloped downward, leading deeper into the ground. This was planned, Luca said. He has been preparing for this. Then we hunt him down and finish it, Marco growled. They moved through the passage, their footsteps echoing softly. The beam of the flashlight bounced off the uneven walls, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. After several minutes, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Luca swept the flashlight around, revealing what looked like an old root cellar, long abandoned. Wooden crates were stacked against the walls, covered in dust and cobwebs. But in the center of the room, sitting on a small table, was a lantern. It was lit, casting a warm, flickering glow. Marco and Luca approached cautiously. Beside the lantern was a handwritten note. Luca picked it up and read it aloud. You want the ledger, but do you know what it contains? Names, dates, secrets that could destroy what is left of the family. Dominic sent you here because he is desperate. He thinks the past can save him, but the past only devours. Marco crumpled the note and threw it to the ground. He is playing games. We do not have time for this. Luca said nothing. He was staring at one of the crates. He moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the wooden surface. Stenciled on the side, faded but still legible, were the words, "Property of Salvatore Greco." Luca's eyes narrowed. He pried open the crate with his knife. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were stacks of cash. Old bills, bundled and preserved, hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. Marco whistled low. The old man was holding out on everyone. Luca opened another crate. More cash. And beneath the cash, weapons, pistols, shotguns, even a couple of submachine guns, all carefully maintained and oiled. This was not just a hiding place, it was an arsenal. He was ready for war, Luca said quietly. He has been ready for years. Marco grinned. Then we give him one. But before he could move, they heard it. A sound from somewhere deeper in the chamber. A soft scraping, like metal on stone. Then a voice. Not Vincent this time. A woman. Margaret. "Please," she called out, her voice trembling. "Please do not hurt him. He only wanted to protect us." Marco and Luca exchanged a glance. Luca motioned for Marco to stay quiet, then called out into the darkness. "Where are you?" There was a pause. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice closer now. "I am here, in the back room. He locked me in. I do not know what he's planning, but please, you have to stop him before someone gets killed." Marco moved toward the sound of her voice, his pistol raised. Luca followed, more cautious. At the far end of the chamber was another doorway, this one partially blocked by fallen debris. Marco kicked it aside and stepped through. The room beyond was small, lit by a single candle, and there, sitting on the floor with her hands bound, was Margaret Carraro. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked up at them, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank God," she whispered. "Please untie me. He has lost his mind. He thinks you are going to kill us." Marco lowered his pistol slightly and stepped closer. But Luca remained in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. Something was wrong. The candle, the ropes, the fear in her eyes. It was all too perfect. "Stop," Luca said sharply. Marco froze. "What?" Luca pointed to the floor. Marco looked down and saw it. A thin wire, almost invisible, stretched across the threshold of the room. A tripwire. Margaret's expression changed. The fear vanished, replaced by something cold and hard. She looked at Luca and smiled faintly. "You are smarter than you look," she said. Then she pulled her hands free. The ropes had never been tied. She rolled to the side just as the room exploded, not literally, but the sound was deafening. A mechanical grinding, and then the floor beneath Marco's feet gave way. He fell, his arms flailing, his pistol flying from his hand. He plummeted into darkness, his body slamming into something hard. Pain shot through his ribs, his shoulder. He gasped for air, disoriented. Above him, he could hear Luca shouting, but the words were muffled, distant. Marco tried to move, but his body would not respond. He was lying in some kind of pit, the walls slick with moisture. He could feel water pooling around him, cold and rising fast. Then, from above, a light appeared. Vincent's face, illuminated by a flashlight, stared down at him. "I told you," Vincent said quietly. "This farm is not what it seems." Marco tried to speak, but only a groan escaped his lips. Vincent disappeared, and the light went with him. Marco was left in the darkness, the water rising higher, his body broken and useless. Above, in the chamber, Luca had pulled himself back from the edge of the collapsing floor. He watched as Margaret climbed to her feet, brushing dust from her clothes. She looked at him calmly, as if nothing had happened. "Your friend is in the old well," she said. "It fills with rainwater this time of year. He has maybe 10 minutes before he drowns." Luca raised his pistol, aiming it at her head. "Where is your husband?" Margaret did not flinch. "Close," she said. "Watching, waiting." Luca's jaw tightened. He did not have time for this. He could hear Marco's faint cries from the pit, growing weaker. He had to make a choice. Save Marco or pursue Vincent. "Tell him to stop this," Luca said. "Tell him we can negotiate." Margaret laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Negotiate? You came here to kill us. Do not insult me with lies." Luca lowered the pistol slightly. "Dominic does not want you dead. He wants the book. If Vincent gives it to us, we leave. That is the deal." Margaret shook her head. "There is no deal. Vincent knows what happens to men like him. Loose ends. He has spent 30 years preparing for this moment, and you walked right into it." Luca stared at her, trying to read her. She was not afraid. She was not even angry. She was simply resigned, as if this outcome had been inevitable all along. "Where is the real ledger?" Luca asked. Margaret smiled faintly. "You think what you found in the cellar was real? Vincent would never keep something that valuable in such an obvious place. That book was a fake, a lure, and you took it." Luca's blood ran cold. He pulled the ledger from his coat and flipped through it again, more carefully this time. The handwriting looked authentic. The names seemed real, but as he studied the pages, he began to see it. Small inconsistencies, dates that did not quite line up, names that were too obvious, too convenient. It was a forgery, a good one, but a forgery nonetheless. Luca closed the book slowly, his mind racing. Dominic had sent them here for nothing. Vincent had played them from the start. "Where is the real one?" Luca demanded. Margaret said nothing. She simply turned and walked toward the passageway, disappearing into the darkness. Luca cursed under his breath. He holstered his pistol and moved to the edge of the pit where Marco had fallen. He shone his flashlight down and saw the enforcer half submerged in water, his face pale and gasping. "Hold on!" Luca called down. "I am getting you out." But even as he said it, he knew it would not be easy. The walls of the pit were slick, and there was no rope, no ladder, and every second he spent trying to save Marco was a second Vincent and Margaret were escaping. Luca made his decision. He pulled a length of cable from his pack and fashioned a makeshift rope. He lowered it into the pit and called down to Marco, "Grab on! I will pull you up!" Marco's hands, weak and trembling, grasped the cable. Luca pulled, his muscles straining. Inch by inch, Marco rose from the water. It took nearly 5 minutes, but finally, Marco's bulk emerged from the pit, soaked and shivering. He collapsed on the floor, coughing up water. "The old man?" Marco gasped. "Where is he?" "Gone," Luca said. "And the book we took is fake." Marco's eyes widened. "What?" Luca helped him to his feet. "We need to leave, now, before this place kills us." But as they turned toward the passage, they heard it, a sound that made them both freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, coming from above. And then a voice, calm and commanding, echoed down through the chamber. "Vincent, you are not the only ones Dominic sent," he said. "He does not trust you to finish the job, so he sent others, and now they are here." Luca and Marco looked at each other, realizing the truth. They had been expendable from the start. Dominic had sent them as the first wave, knowing they might fail. And now a second team was coming to clean up the mess. Above them, they could hear the sound of engines. Vehicles arriving, doors slamming, men shouting orders. Vincent's voice came again, softer now, almost sad. "I tried to warn you. The past devours everything, and now it is going to devour you too." The lights went out again, and in the darkness, the sound of gunfire began. The gunfire was deafening, echoing through the underground chambers like thunder trapped in stone. Luca dragged Marco behind a stack of crates as bullets tore through the air above them, splintering wood and sending up clouds of dust. Marco was still weak from the pit, his body shaking with cold and exhaustion, but his survival instinct kicked in. He grabbed his pistol from where it had fallen and fired blindly toward the passage entrance. "How many?" Marco shouted over the noise. Luca risked a glance around the crate. In the dim light filtering down from the passage, he could see shadows moving, at least 4, maybe 5 men descending into the chamber. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured. Professional. This was not a crew of street soldiers. These were the men Dominic sent when he wanted something done right. "Too many," Luca said. "We need to move." But there was nowhere to go. The chamber had only two exits, the passage they had come through, now blocked by the second team, and the pit where Marco had nearly drowned. They were trapped. One of the men above shouted down, his voice hard and commanding, "Luca! Marco! Dominic wants you alive! Drop your weapons and come up! No one else has to die tonight!" Marco spat blood and laughed bitterly. "You hear that? Dominic wants us alive, so he can kill us himself." Luca said nothing. He was thinking, calculating. The second team had the advantage of numbers and position, but they were unfamiliar with the terrain. Vincent had spent 30 years turning this farm into a maze, and Luca suspected there were more traps, more passages they had not yet discovered. "We go deeper," Luca said. "There has to be another way out." Marco looked at him like he was insane. "Deeper? Into this death trap? Better than dying here." Marco grimaced but nodded. They moved quickly, staying low, using the crates for cover. More gunfire erupted behind them, bullets ricocheting off stone. Luca led the way toward the back of the chamber, where Margaret had disappeared earlier. There, hidden behind a collapsed shelf, was another narrow passage. They squeezed through just as the second team reached the bottom of the main passage. Luca could hear their footsteps, cautious and deliberate, spreading out to search the chamber. He and Marco moved as quietly as they could, the passage twisting and descending further into the earth. The air grew colder, damper. The walls were slick with moisture, and the smell of rot was stronger here. After several minutes of crawling through the tight space, the passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the first. And there, waiting for them in the dim light of a single oil lamp, was Vincent Carraro. He stood beside a wooden table, his hands resting on its surface. On the table was the real ledger, the leather cover worn and cracked, but unmistakably authentic. Beside it was a revolver, old but well-maintained. Vincent looked at them with tired eyes. "You are persistent," he said. "I will give you that." Luca raised his pistol, aiming it at Vincent's chest. "No more games, old man. Give us the book." Vincent did not move. He simply looked at Luca with something like pity. "You do not understand, do you? This is not about the book. It never was. Dominic does not want the ledger to rebuild the family. He wants it to destroy the people who came before him. The old capos, the old soldiers who remember how things used to be. He wants to erase the past so he can build his own empire without competition." Marco leaned against the wall, his breathing labored. "So what? You kept the book for 30 years to protect them, the same people who would have killed you if they knew you took it." Vincent shook his head. "I kept it because I knew one day someone would come for it, and when they did, I would be ready." Luca's finger tightened on the trigger. "Enough talking. The book. Now." Vincent picked up the ledger slowly, holding it in both hands. He looked at it for a long moment, as if saying goodbye to an old friend. Then he opened it to a page near the middle and turned it toward Luca. "Look," Vincent said. "See for yourself." Luca hesitated, then stepped closer, keeping his pistol trained on Vincent. He glanced down at the page. It was a list of names, dates, and locations, but one entry stood out, written in bold, underlined twice. Dominic Falcone, informant. Federal Bureau of Investigation, 2019 present. Luca's blood went cold. He read it again slowly, making sure he was not misreading, but there was no mistake. Dominic, the man they worked for, the man who was supposed to be rebuilding the family, was an informant, a rat. Marco pushed himself off the wall and looked over Luca's shoulder. His face went pale. "That cannot be real," Marco said. "Dominic would never—" "Read the next page," Vincent said quietly. Luca turned the page. There were copies of documents, bank transfers, meeting notes, all of it detailing Dominic's cooperation with federal agents. He had been feeding them information for years, using his position in the family to dismantle it from the inside while pretending to rebuild it. Marco stepped back, his hands shaking. "He sold us out, all of us." Vincent closed the ledger and set it back on the table. "Now you see why I could never let this fall into the wrong hands. Dominic wanted this book not to save the family, but to destroy the last people who could expose him. And once he had it, he would have killed anyone who knew the truth, including you. Luca lowered his pistol slowly. His mind was racing. Everything made sense now. The secrecy, the desperation. The second team sent to eliminate witnesses. Dominic had never intended for them to come back alive. "What do we do?" Marco asked, his voice hollow. Vincent looked at them both, his expression unreadable. "You have two choices. You can take the book and try to run. Hope that Dominic does not find you before the feds do. Or you can stay here and fight. Help me finish this." "Finish what?" Luca asked. Vincent picked up the revolver from the table and checked the cylinder. It was fully loaded. "Dominic sent his men here to kill me and take the book, but he made a mistake. He underestimated me, and now I am going to make sure he pays for it." Before Luca could respond, they heard voices echoing down the passage. The second team was getting closer. Vincent moved quickly, pulling a tarp off a stack of crates in the corner. Inside were more weapons, ammunition, and something else. Explosives. Old dynamite, carefully wrapped and preserved. "I have been preparing for this moment for 30 years, Vincent said. "This farm is wired, every passage, every chamber. If I want, I can bring the whole thing down." Marco stared at him. "You are insane." Vincent smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but I am also free. I have nothing left to lose. Margaret is safe. I made sure of that before you arrived. She's miles away by now, with enough money to start over. This place, this life, it was always temporary. I knew it would end this way." Luca holstered his pistol and looked at Vincent. "If we help you, what do we get?" Vincent picked up the ledger and held it out to Luca. "You get the truth, and a chance to destroy the man who betrayed you. Take this to the right people, and Dominic Falcone will spend the rest of his life in prison. Or you can kill him yourselves. I do not care. But either way, the family he is trying to build dies with him." Luca took the ledger, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He looked at Marco, who nodded slowly. "We are already dead if we go back to Dominic," Marco said. "Might as well die fighting." Vincent nodded, satisfied. "Good. Then let us give them a war they will not forget." He moved to the wall and pressed a hidden switch. Somewhere in the darkness, machinery groaned to life. The sound of grinding metal filled the air, and then the lights came on, not just in this chamber, but throughout the entire underground network. The second team would be able to see now, but so would Vincent and his unlikely allies. Vincent handed weapons to Luca and Marco, then picked up a detonator from the table. It was a simple device, a single button protected by a safety switch. "When I press this," Vincent said, "the entire farm goes up. The house, the barn, every passage underground. Anyone still here dies, so if you want to live, you follow my lead and you move fast." He started toward the passage, but Luca grabbed his arm. "Why are you doing this? You could have run, taken the book and disappeared again." Vincent looked at him, and for the first time, Luca saw the depth of exhaustion in the old man's eyes. "Because I am tired of running," Vincent said. "Because Margaret deserves to live without looking over her shoulder, and because some debts can only be paid in blood." He pulled his arm free and moved into the passage. Luca and Marco followed, their weapons ready. Behind them, the voices of the second team grew louder. They were close now. Vincent led them through a series of twisting corridors, moving with surprising speed for a man his age. He knew every turn, every hidden door. At one point, they passed a narrow alcove where Vincent stopped and pulled a lever. Behind them they heard a crash, followed by screams. One of the traps had been sprung. "That will slow them down," Vincent said, his voice cold. They continued until they reached a ladder leading up to the surface. Vincent climbed first, pushing open a trap door that led into the barn. Moonlight streamed through the gaps in the walls, illuminating the space. It was filled with old farming equipment, rusted and forgotten. Vincent moved to the center of the barn and knelt beside a metal drum. He opened it, revealing more explosives, wired together with a timer. "This is the primary charge," Vincent said. "When the detonator goes off, this will ignite and take out the barn. The explosion will collapse the underground passages and trap anyone still inside. Marco looked around nervously. What about us? Vincent pointed to the far side of the barn, where a pickup truck sat covered by a tarp. We use that. It is gassed up and ready. We drive until we are clear. Then I trigger the detonator. Luca nodded, but before they could move, the barn doors burst open. 3 men from the second team rushed in, their weapons raised. Gunfire erupted instantly. Vincent dove behind the metal drum. Luca and Marco returned fire from behind a stack of hay bales. The noise was deafening, muzzle flashes lighting up the barn like lightning. One of the men went down, clutching his chest. The other 2 took cover behind the farming equipment. Vincent pulled the detonator from his coat and flipped off the safety. He looked at Luca and Marco. "Get to the truck, now!" "What about you?" Luca shouted. Vincent smiled, a sad, final smile. "I am staying. Someone has to make sure they do not follow." Marco started to argue, but Vincent cut him off. "Go. Tell the world what Dominic did. Make sure Margaret is safe. That is all I ask." Luca hesitated, then nodded. He grabbed Marco and pulled him toward the truck. They threw off the tarp and climbed inside. The keys were in the ignition. Luca started the engine, and it roared to life. Behind them, Vincent stood and fired at the 2 remaining men, drawing their attention. Bullets tore into the metal drum, sparking, but not igniting. Not yet. Luca slammed the truck into gear and crashed through the barn doors, wood splintering around them. They roared out into the night, the farm shrinking behind them. Inside the barn, Vincent dropped his empty revolver and pulled the detonator close. The 2 men advanced on him, their weapons trained on his chest. "End of the line, old man," one of them said. Vincent looked at him calmly. "For all of us." He pressed the button. The explosion lit up the night sky like a second sun. The explosion shook the earth for miles. The fireball rose into the night sky, turning darkness into day for a brief, terrible moment. Luca kept his foot on the accelerator, the truck bouncing violently over the dirt road as debris rained down around them. Marco gripped the dashboard, his face pale, staring back at the inferno consuming the farm. "He's gone," Marco said quietly. "The old man is gone." Luca did not respond. He focused on the road, putting as much distance between them and the farm as possible. Behind them, the fire continued to rage, black smoke billowing into the sky. Within minutes, they heard sirens in the distance. Fire trucks, police, maybe even federal agents. The explosion would draw attention, and questions would follow. But by then, Luca and Marco would be long gone. They drove for 2 hours in silence, heading south on back roads, avoiding highways and toll booths. The ledger sat on the seat between them, wrapped in the oilcloth Vincent had used to protect it for 30 years. It felt heavier than it should, weighted not just with paper and ink, but with the lives it had destroyed and the secrets it contained. Finally, as dawn began to break over the horizon, Luca pulled the truck off the road and into an abandoned rest stop. He killed the engine and sat back, exhausted. Marco leaned his head against the window, his eyes closed. "What now?" Marco asked. Luca picked up the ledger and unwrapped it. He opened it to the page that had changed everything, the page that named Dominic Falcone as an informant. He stared at it for a long time, his jaw tight. "We finish what Vincent started," Luca said. "We make sure Dominic pays for what he did." Marco opened his eyes and looked at him. "You want to kill him?" Luca shook his head. "Death is too easy. He sold out the family to save himself. He destroyed lives, turned men into rats. Also, he could build his own empire on the ashes. No, I want him to live. I want him to see everything he built collapse. I want him to spend the rest of his life in a cell, knowing that everyone he betrayed is out there waiting." Marco thought about it, then nodded slowly. "So, we take this to the feds." "Not directly," Luca said. "We need leverage first. We need to make copies, send them to the right people, journalists, lawyers, people who cannot be bought or silenced, and we need to make sure Margaret is safe." Marco frowned. Vincent said she was miles away by now. "How do we find her?" Luca turned to the back of the ledger. There, in Vincent's careful handwriting, was a short note. "If you are reading this, I am dead. Margaret is at the red safe house. The coordinates are below. Take care of her. She deserves peace. Below the note was a set of coordinates, along with an access code. Luca pulled out his phone and entered the coordinates into a map. The location appeared deep in the mountains, far from any major roads or towns. "That is where we go first," Luca said. "We find Margaret, make sure she is safe, then we deal with Dominic." Marco nodded, but his expression was troubled. "You think Dominic knows we are alive?" Luca started the truck again. "He will soon, and when he does, he will send everything he has to hunt us down. But by then, it will be too late." 3 days later in the city, Dominic Falcone sat in his penthouse suite, staring at the television screen. The news was covering the explosion at the farm. Authorities had found the remains of several bodies in the wreckage, burned beyond recognition. Forensic teams were still working to identify them, but preliminary reports suggested at least 5 people had died in the blast. Dominic turned off the television and poured himself a drink. His hand was steady, but inside, his mind was racing. He had sent 2 teams to retrieve the ledger. Neither had reported back. The farm was destroyed, and there was no sign of the book. His phone rang. He answered it without looking at the caller ID. "Dominic," a voice said. It was calm, professional. Federal Agent Sarah Chen, his handler. "What do you want?" Dominic said, his tone cold. "We need to talk, in person. Now." Dominic's jaw tightened. "I told you, no contact unless absolutely necessary." "This is necessary. Meet me at the usual place in 1 hour. Do not be late." The line went dead. Dominic set the phone down and stared at his drink. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Chen never contacted him directly unless there was a problem. And right now, everything was a problem. He drained the glass, grabbed his coat, and headed for the door. The usual place was an underground parking garage in a quiet part of the city. Dominic arrived exactly on time, his car pulling into the designated spot. Agent Chen was already there, leaning against her sedan, her arms crossed. She was in her 40s, sharp-featured, with short, dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. Dominic got out of his car and approached her. "What is this about?" he asked. Chen pulled an envelope from her coat and handed it to him. "Open it." Dominic took the envelope and tore it open. Inside were photographs. His stomach dropped. They were copies of pages from the ledger. His name, his deals with the FBI, his informant status, all laid out in excruciating detail. "Where did you get these?" Dominic demanded, his voice rising. "They were sent to my office this morning," Chen said, along with copies sent to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and 3 different law firms. "By now, half the city knows you are a rat." Dominic's hands shook. He crumpled the photographs and threw them to the ground. "This is impossible. The ledger was destroyed. It burned with the farm." Chen shook her head. "Clearly it did not. Someone has it, and they are using it to destroy you." Dominic turned away, his mind racing. Luca, Marco, they had survived. They had taken the book, and now they were exposing him. He slammed his fist against the hood of his car. "I need protection," he said. "Witness protection. You owe me that." Chen laughed bitterly. "Protection? Dominic, do you have any idea what you have done? You were supposed to help us dismantle organized crime, not rebuild it. You used your informant status to eliminate your competition and consolidate power. You turned the FBI into your personal hit squad. And now, thanks to this ledger, every single operation you touched is compromised. Judges you paid off, cops you corrupted, all of it is coming to light." Dominic stared at her, his face pale. "So what are you saying?" Chen stepped closer, her voice hard. "I am saying you are on your own. The Bureau is cutting ties. Your immunity deal is void. And if I were you, I would start running, because the people you betrayed are coming for you." She got into her car and drove away, leaving Dominic standing alone in the empty garage. He stood there for a long moment, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the concrete space. He turned and saw them. 3 men emerging from the shadows. They were not dressed like federal agents. They were dressed like soldiers. His soldiers. Or rather, the soldiers he had betrayed. The leader stepped forward. It was Tony Marcello, a capo Dominic had sent to prison 3 years ago by feeding information to the feds. He had gotten out 6 months ago, and Dominic had assumed he was lying low, broken. He was wrong. Tony smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "Hello, Dominic," he said. "We need to talk." Dominic backed toward his car, but the other 2 men moved quickly, cutting off his escape. He reached for his phone, but Tony raised a hand. "Do not bother. No one is coming to save you. Not the feds, not your crew. You are alone." Dominic's voice cracked. "Tony, listen. I can explain. I can make this right." Tony laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Make it right. You sent me to prison. You destroyed my life. My family thinks I'm a rat because of you, and now I find out it was you all along. You were the informant. You were the traitor." He pulled a pistol from his coat and aimed it at Dominic's chest. "I should kill you right here, but that would be too easy. No, you are going to suffer first." Tony nodded to the other 2 men. They grabbed Dominic, forcing him to his knees. Tony knelt beside him and leaned close. "The family is gone, Dominic. You made sure of that, but the memories remain. And so do the debts. Every man you betrayed, every life you ruined, they all want their piece of you, and we are going to make sure they get it." Dominic tried to speak, but one of the men struck him across the face, splitting his lip. Blood ran down his chin. Tony stood and holstered his pistol. "Take him to the warehouse," he said. "We have a lot to discuss." They dragged Dominic away, his screams echoing through the empty garage. High in the mountains, Margaret Carraro sat on the porch of the red safe house, a small cabin hidden among the trees. The air was cold and clean, the sky a brilliant blue. She held a cup of coffee in her hands, steam rising in the crisp air. She had received word 2 days ago. Vincent was dead. The farm was gone, but his plan had worked. The ledger was safe, and Dominic Falcone was finished. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a grief that would never fully heal. But she also felt something else. Relief. For the first time in 30 years, she did not have to look over her shoulder. She did not have to wonder when the past would catch up to them. Vincent had given her that gift, his final act of love. She heard a vehicle approaching and set down her coffee. A truck pulled up to the cabin and 2 men got out. Luca and Marco. They looked exhausted, battered, but alive. Luca carried the ledger under his arm. Margaret stood and walked down the steps to meet them. "You kept your promise," she said quietly. Luca nodded. Vincent was a good man. He deserved better than what the family gave him. Margaret smiled faintly. "He made his choices, and in the end, he chose to protect me. That is all that matters." She gestured toward the cabin. "There is food inside. Rest. You both look like you need it." Marco nodded gratefully and headed inside, but Luca stayed, holding out the ledger to Margaret. "This belongs to you now," he said. "Do with it what you will." Margaret looked at the book, then shook her head. "No. It belongs to the world now. Make sure it reaches the right people. Make sure everyone knows the truth." Luca hesitated, then nodded. He tucked the ledger back under his arm and turned to go. But Margaret called out to him. "Luca." He stopped and looked back. "Thank you," she said, "for giving my husband the ending he wanted, for making sure his sacrifice meant something." Luca said nothing. He simply nodded and walked away. Margaret watched them drive off, the truck disappearing down the mountain road. Then she turned and walked back into the cabin, closing the door behind her. She sat by the fire and allowed herself for the first time in decades to weep for Vincent, for the life they had lost, for the peace they had finally found. 6 months later, the story broke. Major newspapers ran articles detailing the corruption within the remnants of the Greco family, the complicity of federal agents, and the betrayal of Dominic Falcone. Arrests were made. Indictments were handed down. The few remaining members of the family scattered, disappearing into the shadows. Dominic Falcone was found in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. His body was never identified publicly, but those who knew, knew. The old debts had been paid. The old ways had been honored. Luca and Marco vanished. Some said they went to Europe. Others claimed they had died in the chaos that followed. But the truth was simpler. They had taken Vincent's advice. They had disappeared, leaving the past behind, carrying only the memory of an old man who had fought to the very end to protect the woman he loved. And in the mountains, in a small cabin hidden among the trees, Margaret Carraro lived out her days in peace. She tended a small garden, read books by the fire, and every evening as the sun set, she would pour 2 cups of coffee and set one beside an empty chair. "We made it, Vincent," she would whisper. "We finally made it." And in the silence of the mountains, where the past could no longer reach, she found the peace that had eluded them for so long. The shadows of the family had finally been laid to rest. The ledger, once a weapon of power and betrayal, had become an instrument of justice. And the old Consigliere, who had guarded secrets in silence for so long, had finally spoken his truth. The farm was gone. The family was gone. But the memory remained, and that, in the end, was enough.